It was the 79th Annual Academy Awards, and the ceremony was in an awkward place after the previous year, which awarded Crash, considered by many to be one of the worst movies to win Best Picture, the top award as opposed to Brokeback Mountain, which was highly favored to win that night. While some might think that this is hyperbole, the Academy was feeling the heat from film critics and audiences to stay relevant and interesting, with many wondering if the Oscars jumped the shark with this win. The Academy needed to do something that could cool some of the anger down and give out an award that would truly give audiences at home a reason to cheer. Hey, maybe it was time to give Marty the gold. That could do it. Oh, Marty would be in the race this year? With a gangster film to boot? That's great! Hopefully Clint Eastwood won't appear with a World War II movie or something.
You've got to be kidding me.
Well, anyway, the narrative that Martin Scorsese could finally win his much overdue Oscar was certainly an exciting one. And considering The Departed was up against stellar movies like the aforementioned Letters of Iwo Jima, Little Miss Sunshine, Babel, and The Queen, plus a rematch with Clint Eastwood, it was certainly going to be an exciting race for Best Picture. However, there was another race that night that was just as unpredictable, but nowhere near as exciting. After 5 years of Best Animated Feature being an official award, this would be the first year where the race wasn't very exciting or memorable. Sure, no one knew it would win, but no one was particularly excited to find out what would win either. Granted, it felt like the award this year was cursed from the get-go. For the first time in a few years, there were going to be 5 nominees for the category, which should have, in theory, made the race more exciting. However, the 15 eligible films would be whittled down to 14 after it was decided that one of the contenders, Arthur and the Invisibles, did not have enough animation in the film to qualify for the award, thus disqualifying the 15th movie. Now, with only 14 eligible films, there would be only 3 nominations. So with that shakeup out of the way, what got snubbed? Well, not much. The biggest snub was Paprika, a mind-bending mystery by acclaimed director Satoshi Kon, in what would eventually be his final film before his unexpected death. Weird, brilliantly animated, and with a captivating original story, there was no reason this should not have been one of the 3 nominees. The other notable snub was A Scanner Darkly, another adult drama from Richard Linklater that used rotoscope technology. While it was a critical darling with critics and also should have been in the actual nominees, animators were still the primary voters picking the nominations, and as we discussed before, animators were typically not fans of rotoscoping, motion capture, basically anything that could be seen as tracing in the industry. Outside of these 2, other so-called snubs included Curious George, Flushed Away, another Ice Age movie, and I guess The Ant Bully had a small chance to get in there. But while most of these were fun for what they were, to nominate them for Oscars would be seen as a little insulting. Sadly, the movies that did get nominated weren't a whole lot better. Pixar entered the race again with Cars, a movie directed by John Lasseter, where he took the whole what happened if toys were alive concept and applied it to cars while excluding human beings from the picture. Critically, the movie did fine and audiences seemed to enjoy it well enough, but many did note that after Finding Nemo and The Incredibles, Cars was certainly not on the same level of those films. Still, the animation was good, the voice acting was notable, especially from the late great Paul Newman, and the songs by Randy Newman contributed not only to a great road trip album, but Our Town with enough of a standout to receive an Oscar nomination for Best Original Song. So going into the night, Pixar had the advantage of being the animated film with the most Oscar nominations. Warner Brothers Animation was back in the race with 2 films. The first was with Happy Feet, directed by George Miller, a name that might not be familiar in animation circles, but who was actually a pretty big deal in Hollywood. This would be his first animated film where he tells the story of a penguin who was unable to partake in the mating rituals of his tribe because he cannot sing, but he has a talent for expressing his emotions through dancing. With an all-star cast including Elijah Wood, Hugh Jackman, Nicole Kidman, and the late Robin Williams voicing multiple characters, the movie was considered a delightful film by critics and audiences. Like Cars, the soundtrack was especially noteworthy for being a great listen for those who loved collecting movie soundtracks. In fact, one of the standouts on the soundtrack was of the late Brittany Murphy, who ended up being a great gospel singer, and some were wondering if she could have a second career in the music industry. Sadly, she would pass away way too young, and Happy Feet would be one of her final major projects. The biggest strike against the movie was oddly the ending, which took a very pro-environmental stance on the dangers of global warming. Despite the fact that the movie was actually quite nice to humans and suggested that we could eventually come to our senses to fix the problems we were causing, many viewers, primarily conservatives I hate to say, felt the ending was preaching to kids, ignoring their own history of preaching to kids in the medium of film. Regardless, the film was a box office hit, which put it in the conversation to win. The final film was also from Warner Brothers. Monster House was a 3D horror film produced by Robert Zemeckis' Image Movers and Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment. The movie even used the motion capture technology that was used in the Polar Express, only by now the technique had been improved and the characters looked much more natural than they did before. The movie was directed by Gil Kenan, whose previous works were nothing. The kid had basically just graduated college and was given the keys to direct this weird movie. Strangely, he hasn't returned to animation since Monster House either, which suggests he might have used this film as a stepping stone to direct live-action movies, of which he's made a couple of notable ones. While he has had an admirable career in movies, I think this freshman effort was just so darn good. And when I watched it, I thought animation had found a new star director to keep an eye on. A guy who had the potential to be as big as John Lasseter, Don Bluth, or Brad Bird. That's because Monster House is just a genius film about a haunted house that is actually scary. The movie reportedly got a PG-13 rating before the filmmakers added one additional scene at the end to get the MPAA off their back enough to get a PG. This wasn't enough to prevent complaints from parents about kids being scared in the theater, though, and the movie has gone on to become a favorite annual viewing during the Halloween season as a result. And those were the nominees. As you can see, they were a fine, if not mostly unremarkable trio of films. Nothing bad, but nothing too great either. Ironically, the lack of excitement likely contributed to this being an unpredictable race, as there was no obvious frontrunner or universally beloved film. Cars may have had a slight edge with 2 Oscar nominations, but would the Academy really give Pixar a 3rd consecutive Oscar for a movie that was nowhere near as good as the previous 2 films? Maybe this would be a way to honor John Lasseter for how he helped mold Pixar's brain trust, but the man has won a competitive Oscar and was given an honorary award for Toy Story, so there was no overdue status for him. When the Oscars started, it was already off to a strange foot, as Eddie Murphy, long considered to be the favorite to win Best Supporting Actor for Dreamgirls, lost to underdog Alan Arkin for Little Miss Sunshine. It did suggest that the Academy would have another unpredictable show. The Academy was prepared, though. When Cameron Diaz came out to present the award for Best Animated Feature, they brought back the animated characters in the audience to react to the results of the award. One of the notable things is that Pixar was also asked to create a loser animation. And while I'm sure the Academy would have required it anyway, it is funny to think that Cars winning was such a non-lock that animation was created just in case the movie lost. And before everyone knew it, the moment of truth had arrived.
And the Oscar goes to, let's see, Happy Feet, George Miller.
And Pixar's winning streak came to an end, and Warner Brothers had won their first Academy Award for Best Animated Feature Film. For most, it was an okay moment. But really, when you take a step back, Was there any particular reason Happy Feet came out ahead of the other two movies? Believe it or not, there are likely 5 good reasons why the Penguins danced their way to victory. Number 1, Pixar had been over-rewarded at this point. While there would eventually become a problem with Pixar and Disney being genuinely given more awards than they probably deserved, the bottom line is Pixar had just been winning so much recently, Academy voters were likely sick of them. While it's hard to argue against Finding Nemo and The Incredibles winning an Oscar, after having just come off 2 masterpieces, Cars needed to be just as great, if not better, to keep the streak going. And while Cars is a fine film in its own right, as mentioned above, few people actually loved it, and the box office was one of the weaker outings. Which actually brings us to our second point. Number 2, Cars was perceived as a toy commercial. Alright, before anyone comments, though I feel free to discuss anything you'd like to in the comment section below, Cars might have been unfairly seen as a toy commercial. I know it sounds strange, but while the movie got decent reviews and an okay box office result, one thing that was brought up in many Disney shareholder meetings was how good the toy sales were. To be blunt, toys for Cars flew off the shelves and made the company more money than the actual movie did. The toys sold so well that Disney, who under the new leadership of Bob Iger, acquired the company outright 2 months before Cars was released in theaters. And we're already talking about a sequel based solely on the strength of the toy sales. And rumors about Pixar expanding the Cars world to planes and boats also started circulating. Was one of those things actually happening? While maybe a small part, the idea that the Academy would give an Oscar to a movie that had more success as an unwitting commercial to sell merchandise may have rubbed the Academy the wrong way, and likely would again in the future. We'll talk about that when we get there. And maybe convince a small but important amount of voters to look elsewhere. Number 3. March of the Penguins had won the previous year. Alright, this is more of a conspiracy on my part, I admit. But I'm personally convinced that March of the Penguins winning Best Documentary Feature Film the previous year had a spillover effect in how the Oscar voters voted in the animated feature category this year. I think Penguins were still on the voters' minds, and some of them voted accordingly. Although this one may be more of a theory on my part, there is probably no denying the fourth point. With number 4, Happy Feet left audiences feeling happy. Simply put, Happy Feet left audiences feeling happy. It doesn't matter if you care much for the movie, and there are certainly issues with it to be sure, but if you saw this in theaters with a crowd of families, you were treated to the sight of kids dancing in the aisles and everyone having a great time, sometimes singing along to the songs. Even those who disliked the film had to admit that some of the musical numbers left a smile on their face. Compare that to Cars, which could be a somber at some points and focus more on excitement in the end, and especially Monster House, which was more focused on scaring you, even being creepy to the adults. Happy Feet just left voters feeling, I'm going to emphasize this again, happy when all was said and done. However, despite all these reasons, Happy Feet, I think, had one major trump card that none of the other movies had. Number 5, George Miller directed it. Yes, the fact that Happy Feet was directed by George Miller is likely the number one thing that tipped the Oscar in its favor. Now, most of you watching are likely animation fans, so if George Miller doesn't sound like a familiar name, there may be a reason for that. Miller, technically speaking, doesn't work much in the field of animation. As a director, he had made many films with great visual flair, but he had never directed a 100% animated feature before. And while it would be easy to say that nothing in his filmography suggested he would ever work in animation, the reality is nothing in Miller's filmography suggests he should make any of the movies he does. You see, George Miller is a madman of a director, with no discernible style to pin down. While filmmakers such as Hayao Miyazaki, Alfred Hitchcock, And even Steven Spielberg, to an extent, have styles, motifs, and discernible cinematic fingerprints in their films. Miller is someone who constantly challenges himself and thus appears to have no locked-in style. He burst onto the scene by directing the Mad Max trilogy, and these 3 films would be the only time you could really pinpoint reoccurring styles in his work. After that, though, he worked on The Witches of Eastwick, a dark fantasy comedy that was as different from his action trilogy as could be. Then, he would make a true adult drama with Lorenzo's Oil, which would net Miller his first Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay. He would then move on to write and produce Babe, a movie that would receive a nomination for Best Picture and one of the rare family films to achieve such an accomplishment. He didn't direct that movie, though, because he was busy directing a documentary called 40,000 Years of Dreaming, which he would also serve as a presenter. He did return to Babe Pig in the City, where he would also direct, in addition to writing and producing that sequel. And finally, after this, he would go on to direct Happy Feet and Happy Feet 2. And while the Academy had no way of knowing it, he would be following up these films by directing Mad Max Fury Road, one of the greatest action films of all time in my opinion, and 3,000 Years of Longing, which, folks, if you want to watch something that is truly original, find a way to watch 3,000 Years of Longing. It is truly a visionary experience, unlike any other. Needless to say, George Miller is a true artist of a director, and well known in the industry. In a year where all 3 nominees for Best Animated Feature were simply fine, the chance to give an Oscar to a respected director who had never won an Academy Award was likely way too good of an opportunity for voters to pass up. Without a clearly better than the rest film in contention, many Oscar voters likely looked at the directors. Lasseter had won a couple statues already, and Keenan was still, figuratively speaking, wearing diapers in the industry. But George Miller? That was a guy who paid his dues and was well respected. It was probably funny to voters to give him an Oscar for an animated film, but in the end, they could reward one of their peers with an Oscar, and that was likely the biggest sway of the vote. In the end, Happy Feet is a fine winner. I agree that it probably isn't great, and if I were casting a vote, I personally would have picked Monster House, but it makes sense in hindsight why Happy Feet won. It also lessens the sting of Miller losing Best Director for Mad Max Fury Road years later, knowing that the man does have at least one Oscar on his shelf at home. Overall, though, while there was certainly a race this year, it wasn't one that many had much of a stake in. Things would change the following year, though, as not only would the Academy Awards be celebrating their 80th anniversary, but Pixar would be back in the race again in a very big way, facing off against a 2D French film that would be declared one of the most unique animated films of all time. I'll see you all then. By the way, here's a fun fact to end the episode on. George Miller's favorite movie of all time is Walt Disney's Pinocchio. So for that reason alone, I'm glad he contributed to the history of animation.
Hey, you made it to the end. Thank you so much for making it to the end. Just a few more things. First of all, the names that you see on the screen, these are our Patreon and YouTube member supporters, and I thank each and every one of them. Their support helps me make exclusive videos for Patreon and YouTube members, as well as keep the channel running, and of course is just of huge kindness to me. Also, don't forget to check out the iCritic-led podcast on Spotify, Apple, Google, Deezer, whatever podcasting service you listen to, it is there. We definitely want to see you there. And hey, there's also other videos that you can check out. So, check out these other channels, these other videos, especially that one. I think that's a really good one.